Hey guys, so in this episode, I have a really great conversation with Paige Myers, who is a registered dietitian who actually specializes with working in powerlifters in her own private practice. But she does have some also professional work in dietetics outside of powerlifting, but she's just a wealth of knowledge with powerlifting, nutrition, and there's a lot of really unique things that we talk about in this podcast. I don't really think I've heard on really any other podcast talking about powerlifting nutrition, to really maximize your performance, your health, your body composition goals, and whatnot. So guys are really going to enjoy this episode. But before we get into it, I want to just let you guys know that I have a awesome coaching service that's really designed to really help you add 50 pounds to your total, get a strong athletic physique, and destroy your training plateaus in just 90 days. And really, this is to really ensure that you have 100% chance of success. The worst thing you can possibly do as a powerlifter, spend all this time in the gym training, worrying about all these small details without really knowing 100%, am I doing everything right to reach my goals? And really, that's what my coaching program is designed to do: is eliminate all that worry, all that guesswork, allow you to just be an athlete, and rely on my 6+ years of coaching experience, the over $100,000 I invested in my education, and whatnot, to just really allow you to become the best athlete you possibly can. Look good while getting strong, and really just dominate the platform. So this is something you guys are interested in. There are links to apply for my service in the show notes, or you can reach out to me on Instagram at Adam D. Peeler. But without further ado, hope you guys enjoy the episode with Paige Myers. All right, guys, welcome back to the Adam Peeler Fitness Podcast. Today on the show, I have Paige Myers. Paige is actually a registered dietitian who specializes in working with strength athletes. Is what I gather. I'm not sure if you do anything clinical. Obviously, let us know about that. But she's also strong as hell too. She's got those deadlift leverages, and I think that she has a lot of really good advice that like I've seen on your Q&As, for example. Like quite a bit, but I don't really. I looked around and was seeing sort of long form content that allows you to sort of let people know a little bit more about you and your practice and whatnot. So this is kind of the opportunity. So thank you so much for coming on. Is there anything else you'd like the listeners to sort of know about you?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Adam. I'm super excited to have this experience to talk with you and, just reach a broader audience here. So a little bit about my background, you hit the nail on the head. I'm a power lifter. I'm a registered dietitian. I have about 4 years now of nutrition coaching experience with athletes, focusing on strength, focusing on performance, body composition, all of that. And I also work full time in GI. So I work with a lot of people on the medical side of things that have IBS, Crohn's, colitis, GI surgeries, that type of thing. So I kind of combined my two backgrounds, and just have a lot of knowledge to share about all of that.
Yeah, and I think that there's an important distinction between dietitians and nutritionists. So on Paige, because a lot of people will say, "Oh, I'm a nutritionist online," but there's a big difference. It's actually quite meaningful between dietetics and nutritionists. So would you mind letting listeners know about that?
Absolutely, yeah. So the biggest difference is the educational background. To become a registered dietitian, you have to do a 4-year undergraduate degree. And now in 2023, it's also required that you do a master's degree on top of your dietetic internship. So basically what it comes down to, it's 6 years of schooling and then 1,200 hours of supervised practice hours. So you're basically working unpaid while doing a master's degree. It's kind of a grueling process, but you learn a lot along the way. So dietitians really have both the textbook knowledge and the hands-on clinical experience.
Yeah, whereas the nutritionists just kind of go online, take like a certification, they have it.
Yeah, anyone can really be a nutritionist. That's the issue with it. If you take a nutrition course, you can call yourself a nutritionist. So all dietitians are nutritionists, but all nutritionists aren't dietitians.
Right. So I think this is an important distinction because, like I said, lots of people probably see dietetics and nutritionists like online and don't really know the difference. So I think that's just important to just get out of the way. So first things first on Paige, like why should powerlifters even really care about their nutrition? It's very common for physique athletes to focus on their nutrition, but less common for strength athletes. And I think that that's really missing a lot of what goes into becoming the best powerlifter you possibly can. So would you mind letting the listeners know a little bit more about your perspective on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And you are so right. Powerlifters should care about their nutrition for a variety of reasons. If we think about first and foremost, just general health, I think you and I both want to live a long, healthy life. We want to stay out of the hospital. We want to not have to be on long-term medications. So playing into your nutrition and focusing on nutrition, you can try to prevent those chronic diseases. So that's first and foremost. That's kind of anyone listening to this podcast. Everyone should care about that. But for powerlifters specifically, to maximize your performance, to maximize your recovery, we should care about body competition or body composition. It's not healthy to have visceral adipose tissue. You want more muscle, less fat on the body. And that can also help with performance too. The more muscle, the more weight you can lift, theoretically speaking. So that aspect of things is important too. Sometimes nutrition will be the thing with powerlifters that separates the good from the best. If you are controlling everything, you're training day in, day out, you're sleeping well, you're drinking your water, you're training hard, but you're not nailing your nutrition, that nutrition is going to be what takes you to the next step. So that's really why powerlifters should care.
Right. And one of the things I notice with my clients, I do give them some guidance with their nutrition. My athletes that tend to focus really highly on really hitting a consistent level of calorie intake, even macronutrient intake. They feel better, more consistently, less sore, and also it's like less guessing of like why am I not making progress? Because if you're controlling everything the best that you possibly can, it's more like predictable going into training. Okay, I'm going to actually be recover or not. Whereas if you're not really tracking that, I mean, you could be way under eating your protein, your calories could be, way all over the place, and you might not be able to understand, well, why is my training not going very well? You might think it's the programming when actually it's what you're not doing. And that's actually something I tell a lot of my clients. Whatever you're not doing is probably why you're not making progress.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. And if you don't pay attention to your nutrition or track anything, you could say that you're getting a carbohydrate rich meal pre-workout and post-workout. If you've never tracked macros before, how do you know that that meal's actually carbohydrate rich? If you think about the typical person that has never paid attention to nutrition before, they're going to think that like pizza is a carbohydrate, when in reality, it's more of a fat than anything. So if you don't know these little things and you've never tracked before, how are you supposed to know? That's where it can be so crucial for athletes to start to learn about macronutrients and, like you said, have a consistent intake so that variable is controlled from day to day.
There's a lot of places we could go off from there. So I guess first thing that came to mind was obviously in order to understand your nutrition, you need to have some sort of nutritional education. And I think a lot of that comes down to like number one, like there's two schools of thought with like actually weighing out your food and tracking your food. I personally am above the opinion from what I've seen that I think that while though you shouldn't be something that you do for the rest of your life or feel like you have to do at all, it's very important to have some exposure to that so you actually understand what portion sizes are. And like what you said, actually look at labels and say, oh, pizza is more fat, and actually peanut butter is not a protein source.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm with you on that too. I think tracking is a really good short-term tool. And honestly, if you're someone that cares about your performance, you care about your physique, it may be a little bit more of a long-term strategy too. But when we're 60 years old, we're probably not going to be weighing out our rice to the gram. But in this stage of life, it can be really helpful for that. And I agree with you. After time, you do learn what 8 ounces of chicken looks like or what 100 grams of rice looks like, and you can eyeball. That's where it sets people up for success when they're traveling or, have to go out to eat those meals off plan. But I do agree with you that most everyone, I should take a step back. There's always contraindications to anything, but most people can benefit from weighing out their food and measuring at some point in life.
So say you have somebody who you're going to go through that intervention where you're saying, hey, let's actually weigh out and track our food. How long would you want somebody to do that for? How meticulous should they be? And then when would be a good time maybe to branch out into more of eyeballing? I know you said that depends on your goals, but say if somebody, finds it stressful, for example, what's something that you might do to help that out?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a really good scenario of an athlete that I'm working with currently, and she was just going through finals at school, and everything was super, super stressful for her. She wasn't able to track everything because it was just adding to her bucket of stress essentially. So in that sense, she'd been with me for now like 4 months. She knows her macros. She knows what those portion sizes look like. And we said, hey, let's aim for protein, carb, fat, fruit, or vegetable at each meal. If you think about your plate, you kind of know based on your macros what that plate looks like. And that's where eyeballing things can be helpful. But I do think it takes at least a couple of months, sometimes more than that. If you've never focused on nutrition and you're brand new to this, it might take a couple months to just learn how to track accurately. And that's not to steer anyone away from this process either. But when you're starting, it's definitely a learning curve. But for example, like I'll say myself, I've been doing this for years now. Now I can really eyeball things. I still track things pretty meticulously, but if I didn't have a food scale, I wouldn't stress.
Yeah, I know. I definitely, I've heard lots of people say, only like 3 weeks, but I'm like, man, there's so many
No.
different sources. There's so many different foods out there. You need to like learn kind of like what they look like. And honestly, I feel like if you are doing it properly, it's like it's really not that difficult. There's a little bit of a learning curve, but especially me, like, I track every single day anyway, all my food, because it takes me maybe 5 minutes to do.
Yep.
And the tracking takes another 5 minutes on top of that. And really, it's also very helpful when you have a family gathering, Thanksgiving or Christmas, for example, or the holiday season right now, or you're going out to eat and, oh, God forbid, you don't know what the macros are, and this is one of the things I tell about my clients was saying, well, if you're going out to eat, if you don't have the nutrition, you're probably going to be around 1,000, 1,200 calories per entree. That's something I only know from like tracking and paying attention to things. And I think that there's plenty of ways actually to do this in a way that doesn't stress people out. One of the most common ways I do is actually encouraging my clients to come up with like a default diet or meal plan with very consistent food choices, because I find that number one, especially from a performance perspective, how you feel matters a lot. And while food quality, it might be also be in terms of hierarchy, it's macronutrients are most important, but then micronutrients also play a pretty key role in how you feel and how you recover. So how varied should your food choices be day to day? How much diversity should you have in your diet? And how would what are some things people should look for when they're basically trying to find a sort of a diet structure that they can consistently adhere to?
Absolutely. And I love your idea of creating like a meal plan essentially for yourself. I have all my clients do that. I like everyone to come up with their go-to meals. You should have a handful of meals that do well for you. You digest them well, you feel good. That can be a pre-workout meal, post-workout meal, different meals for different things where you can adjust the portion sizes to those meals too as your macros change. I think that can be really helpful. And that way on MyFitnessPal, you can save that as a meal or as a recipe. So those portions, like if it's 200 grams chicken, 150-gram rice, 200 grams of veggies, you can just put that in easily. It takes some of the time away from tracking. So I think having that meal structure is very important. And I agree with you. Eating the same structure is important. When we think of a health standpoint, especially with gut health, I'm a GI dietitian. I think about that a lot. Having a variety of plant-based foods is one positive thing to impact the gut microbiome. So by that, that means changing up the fruits and the vegetables that you eat. That may mean changing up the fibrous carbohydrate sources. So for example, if one of your meals has potatoes, maybe switching to sweet potatoes one week, or with your chicken and rice, doing broccoli and Brussels sprouts one week, and then peppers and onions the next week. Getting variety in that sense, but keeping your meal structure the same.
So sort of like consistent like macro targets per meal, sort of different food
Yes.
sources.
Yes,
Cool.
yes. So keeping the meal structure the same, like your protein and your carb are going to be fairly similar, but then maybe changing up the veggies, the fruits that go with it. And that way too, you can change up some of the flavors. You can change up the herbs that you use, the different spices that you have some variety in that sense.
Right. I think you said a really important thing there too about like, things that they enjoy, because the reality is that so something that lots of people, especially that come into fitness, I've noticed when I talk to them about nutrition, they always think that oh man, like if I had adopted a fitness lifestyle or a healthier diet pattern, I'm going to be suffering or super like restricted. And I always tell people, I guarantee you, if you talk to anybody who has been in shape for a long time, the only way they've been able to do that is by having some sort of dietary structure that they enjoy. And one of the things that does change over time is that for a lot of people, when they are just starting something out, their only calculus really with food has ever been how tasty is this, right? And a lot of that comes down
Absolutely.
to they don't really train, they don't really move their bodies. And then once you start to train, you start to take your health a little bit more seriously. Taste does still matter, and that does it as a priority too. But I think it becomes a little bit more into how am I feeling? How is my digestion? Am I bloated? Am I able to get stronger? Because like for myself, it's like I really look forward to eating like my fruit and my vegetables every single day, and my whole grains and lean protein sources and omega threes, omega sixes. I'm like, this is gonna make my body feel really good and feel really healthy. And then if I want to add in some junk foods, I do believe that it should be appropriately flexible, like, but it shouldn't be like overly restrictive at the same time. Sort of find that balance, because if you put people more into like rules, especially, they tend to be like, screw you, I'm not going to follow that. If you give them more ability to make their own choices, build some advocacy around their nutrition, they're better able to just, and this just comes with training too, but they're better able to adhere in the long term.
Yep, I agree with you completely. If you restrict all of the foods that you love, you're never going to be successful. Obviously, there is a balance, and I think that's where people getting into fitness sometimes struggle with finding that balance. But like you said, once you start training hard, you're not gonna have taste for a lot of the foods that you once liked, because you're going to realize they don't necessarily make you feel good. They don't support training. They don't support your digestion. Maybe every once in a while, it's great to have that pizza that you've been craving all week, but it's not going to be part of your everyday diet. And I think people, don't think about that when getting into fitness. And it takes some time to, like you said, your taste buds adapt and you learn a lot about yourself through that process. But I do think everything changes. Something I do for a lot of my athletes is we'll do free meals. So once a week, they have a meal that is untracked. I tell them to go out to eat, maybe cook something at home that usually isn't part of their meal plan, but I like to use that strategy to help with diet adherence, given we're in a spot that we can't do that. If you're 1 week out from a competition, I'm not giving you a free meal. But if we're just training, we're in the off season, we're in a good spot, weight is steady, I absolutely think having some fun foods in your diet is essential.
For sure. And so when we're going over like, approximating calorie intake, obviously we mostly have to go off of body weight. How long do you typically like your clients to sort of track their body weight for before you actually make any sort of like dietary pattern intervention? Obviously, maybe you have a client that comes to you that have past experience of tracking their food, they have consistent TDEE, but like, say you have somebody who's coming to you, they don't track their steps, they have no idea where their maintenance is. And I really think that maintenance is the baseline where everybody should start. It's everybody doesn't want to do that. It's like, oh, I don't want to make progress. But the reality is actually during a maintenance phase, especially if somebody who doesn't have very, assuming if you don't know your maintenance, you probably don't really have a very solid nutritional foundation. During that process, you're going to be making progress anyways by changing some food sources. Maybe you're changing your nutrient timing. But how long do you like to basically track body weights at the certain step count and or activity level in general and macronutrient calorie intake before you might say let's go on a diet or let's go on a muscle gain phase?
Absolutely. So majority of my clients, I do start them at maintenance, and I'll have them track for like a week or so, look at their average intake and kind of base starting macros based on that. If it's someone that's never tracked nutrition before, I may just say focus on the protein goal and carbs or fat or hit or miss. And we just kind of look at the average. And then from there, if we see over a 2 week period their weight go up, we know that that calorie intake is higher than their maintenance. Their weight goes down, obviously they're in a deficit. If it stays the same, we're kind of at maintenance. And maintenance is hard because maintenance is a range. But with that, during that first phase, I like to just call it the health phase. We're learning how to track food, we're learning how to hit protein. That's the one that I focus on most with people at first. That's when we're starting to increase step count. We're starting to pay attention to sleep, to water intake. It's kind of that phase where I don't care as much if they hit the numbers. I just want to see that we're learning the healthy habits essentially.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's it's just so important to say that your habits are going to really carry you throughout the cut or a bulk or whatever. Because I always like one of the main things I see people make an issue of is like I hit my least favorite question is what are your favorite cutting foods, what are your favorite bulking foods? I'm like I eat the
Same.
same thing. Like it's
Yeah.
just I add like an extra protein bar if I'm trying to gain weight, or depending on how if I'm a beginner, maybe I tell them I like two PB&Js or something like that. But it's like the more, and this is why it's so important to have that default diet, because it makes everything so much simpler. Because especially like if you're cutting and you're just super like overly like restricted, like you're not going to maintain that for like a long amount of time anyways. It's not going to be something where you're like you're going to be motivated to do it after. You're going to feel like, oh my gosh, I can't wait until this diet's over. Whereas like it's like, oh, it's a very small intake. I added like 50 grams of carbs at each meal to go to maintenance or something like that. It's a very easy transition.
Absolutely. I second you on that. If you have the same meal structure and say we're in a 500-calorie deficit and we just make the meals smaller, you're still going to have your same routine. We're not changing the foods that you're eating. You're just having smaller portion sizes, and that's where that nutrient timing comes into play too. Like we're still going to have evenly spaced protein throughout the day. We're not going to touch the protein intake. It's going to be your carbs and your fats that are changing. And if you don't have that meal structure, it's kind of a free for all, which makes it really hard for the dieter to adhere to things.
Right. And when it comes down to like, let's say you're eating 4 meals a day and your deficit is like taking roughly 25 grams of carbs away from each meal, it's pretty easy. It's like, oh, like this isn't like that hard. And so that's just really important. So I guess I want to ask you too, you already talked a little about nutrient timing. Um, so in terms of timing like protein first, there's a lot this is the fun macronutrient. There's a lot of research on it, and we're still having it. For listeners that don't know, like nutrition and exercise science are very new fields. That's why a lot of times it's like we don't know, and lots of times like practitioners like Paige are very valuable because they have that firsthand experience, and that's just as important as the science. But in your practice, when you're basically consulting a powerlifter, when you're starting with protein, that's the most important macronutrient of them all. In terms of frequency, timing, and then actually amounts per meal, what do you try to have them adopt in terms of habits?
Yeah, so if we look at the current base of research, we know we need protein about every 3 to 4 hours to keep muscle protein synthesis going. And we need about a minimum of a 30-gram threshold. So protein is the one macronutrient that we're pretty much going to keep the same throughout the day. So if you have a goal of 200 grams of protein, you're going to evenly divide that throughout the day, about every 3 to 4 hours. So for most people, and this is where I butt heads with a lot of power lifters because they don't like to eat multiple times a day. They want to have two large meals, and that is just not optimal at all for body composition, for building muscle, to support training. So I really push more small, frequent meals. And, if we're eating 4 times a day, usually you can hit your protein intake by that. Some people may need more than that. Some people may prefer to eat more than that. Um, you know, we have something to learn from bodybuilders actually as powerlifters. They can learn some from us powerlifters, we can learn from them. But the one thing that the research really is consistent on is that every 3 to 4 hours. So most athletes, I try to get eating more than those 3 meals per day, maybe 4 to 5 meals. If that is too much for them to handle, eating volume, I do push liquid calories sometimes, especially after training, because we know that protein intake after training is so important. There's lots of research too on pre-sleep protein, having protein 2 hours from your last meal. So roughly 30 minutes before bed, like a slow digesting protein to help stimulate muscle protein synthesis overnight. So there's lots of different strategies in terms of how to balance protein throughout the day. The main thing is just the consistent feeding of protein.
Right. So say you have somebody who like likes to like intermittent fast. Um, Obviously there's going to be some optimality that is trade-off there. How much of a trade-off do you think you're sort of getting if you are that person who instead of like having 4 to 5 meals a day, they're having 3 meals a day of protein, but it's still as evenly spread out as they possibly can?
Yeah, and it depends what their goal is. If their goal is to build muscle, having all that time without protein intake or without having consistent protein intake isn't going to be conducive to that goal. Also, whenever you have a very large bolus of protein, say if you're only eating 3 meals, you might have to have like 70 grams of protein at a meal. only so much of that can actually go to muscle protein synthesis. That's not to say that your body's not going to break it down into the different amino acids and use it for different processes in the body, but it's not necessarily going towards muscle protein synthesis. So that's where if you have those smaller, more spread out doses, it's more optimal to actually build muscle.
Right. And so, I guess one of my questions there is, so Lyle McDonald's protein book, and like I've also asked Lyle about this. He has a hypothesis because we don't really have very much research on like larger feedings of protein, like how they actually impact the area under the curve of muscle protein. So this is maybe dragging me out for longer. Like my assumption would be that makes sense from like a practical standpoint. But I do think from explaining, well, we don't really have a stored mechanism for protein. It's something that is like more frequently we can trigger it and maybe have like that spike throughout the day. That could just be more optimal in general. And in all honesty, if you're asking somebody to, say that they don't like eating their carbs like earlier on in the day or many fats, it's something that I even started doing as I realized, well, I really want to maximize my muscle growth. How hard is it to add a protein shake in the morning or get some egg whites? It's really not that difficult. And if you're somebody who really says, hey, I want to be the best product I possibly can, I really want to make sure I'm maximizing performance and recovery and my body composition goals, because if you're nailing more things, it becomes more efficient. It's less drawn out. It's less cattywampus is a weird word, but it's
Uh-huh.
just a lot more predictable in general. But I don't know, like because I do butt heads with powerlifters quite a bit about that. It's like I want to eat 2 meals a day. I'm like, and like I want it, and I'm like, no, Uncrustables aren't a protein. That's not a meal. There has to be protein at your meal. Like I always tell them, like your meal it has to have protein, or else it's not a meal.
Yep. Yep. It's, I would say that is probably the biggest problem that I run into with power lifters, the lack of protein and the lack of meal structure in terms of only having 2 meals per day. Also, if you just think about it from a health standpoint, eating just two very large boluses of food is not optimal for your digestion either. You're
No.
going to walk around bloated. You're going to walk around gassy. It's not good for your bowel movements. There's nothing that comes from eating a very large meal. If you're someone that struggles with acid reflux too, not good for that. So I really agree with you. If you want to be the best power lifter and having a protein shake in the morning is too hard, then you might have to readjust your goals and be realistic here.
Right. And it's always funny to write. So I'm like, hey, like have a protein shake. It's not that hard. Like it's as hard as you make it. It's not hard as like just on one. But I think we've been harping that long enough. I guess in terms of carbohydrate intake. In terms of timing, this obviously a lot of this has to do with activity levels and how big of a person that you are. But let's just say, if you're average powerlifter, in terms of carbohydrate timing, what do you typically like to recommend, and particularly around workout window?
Absolutely, absolutely. So your pre-workout and post-workout meal, regardless of your activity level, regardless of what your goals are, those are going to be the two most important meals of the day. So ideally, if we can have a balanced meal about 3 hours before a lift, so that's going to be protein, carb, fat, fruit, vegetable, like normal balanced meal, anywhere from 2 to 3 hours before the lift. Always recommend that. And then about 30 to 60 minutes before having another bolus of carbs, about 50 grams, somewhere in that range of fast digesting carbohydrates. So think something like a sports drink, rice cakes. Some people can do like dates or bananas. I know they have a little bit of fiber in them. Some people can handle that before, but really we want to focus on having minimal fat or fiber in that little pre-workout snack meal there. And then depending on the length of this session, sometimes I will recommend carbs during the workout in the form of a sports drink, or, a carb supplement, not necessarily eating during a lift, but having some sort of drink. And then post workout, you want to have that carb and protein within 2 hours of having that lift. I typically recommend, as soon as you can, the sooner the better. You're most sensitive to growth 6 hours after you lift. So having those carbs and protein post lift are so important.
Right, and I do think that also, like glycogen, like resynthesis is an important thing, especially when you're dieting and when you don't have like as much glycogen available. If the more you can push those carbohydrates, like especially in that post-workout and having like enough pre-training to actually have energy, you're just going to see a little bit better overall recovery. I personally seen my powerlifters and whatnot, like if they didn't really focus on that, if they actually have, especially carbohydrate mixed with protein, they report less feelings of soreness. And it also just, it shits you more. It's a really important part about that too, I think, is nervous system state management. If you only have protein,
Mhm.
it's not super like relaxing. There's not a lot of parasympathetic demand. Whereas if you have both of them, we know that there's, some neurological or effects of carbohydrates with serotonin and dopamine that help you out with basically relaxing a little bit more and promoting more of that recovery state. So having both those combined is really important.
Absolutely. The research out there, especially the sports nutrition research, a lot of the stuff that the ISSN does is with endurance athletes. So, in terms of carbohydrates and strength training athletes, the research really isn't great in terms of showing is there positive benefit. But I can tell you 1000% with anecdotal evidence of working with people for 4 years, carbs pre-workout are very important for strength athletes. And that's where research with nutrition can be, it's so nuanced. If you look at the populations that they study, lots of the studies are on untrained people too. It can be a really dicey area. That's where, most of the pre-workout recommendations are for like endurance training, running, things like that. But people should absolutely be having carbs pre-workout.
100% agree. I think especially because, although the research kind of show that it's not a large depletion of glycogen in your workouts, we all know as powerlifters, you try lifting when you're flat, try being strong, it ain't happening. You're not going to feel good. You're going to gas out really fast, and you won't have that same sort of pop under the bar.
Absolutely. And it's kind of the same thing with sodium too. A lot
Yes.
of the research doesn't support sodium in terms of strength training, but I can tell you from personal experience, from experience with my clients, most people benefit from some sort of supplement of sodium, some sort of electrolyte drink, especially pre-competition. That is crucial for a lot of people.
Right. Yeah. No, I can tell you from personal experience. So I have chronically like low blood pressure genetically. I realized, I remember the day after last year, I was like, man, I know I ate a ton of carbs. I still feel like cold and like flat and like my squats don't feel very good. I'm like, I'm going to have like a gram of salt. And I got to a gram as I had 500 milligrams. Like, no, it's still ain't it. And I got it. And I was like, holy crap. And then I PR to squat 500 for the first time. And so sodium is definitely not something that powerlifters or really anybody who's active should be concerned about. I guess we could talk about that very briefly. In terms of sodium intake, um, what I personally recommend my athletes is to get a light salt. This has a mixture of potassium and sodium, and just salt all their meals using that. Really not being super concerned about it. But I especially harp on sodium intake in a deficit because if you have less glycogen, you're going to have less intramuscular water retention. And what we can sort of drive that up, especially around a pre-training window, it's really going to be helpful, especially with retaining that strength and endurance during your session.
Absolutely. I agree with that. And I think it depends on the person's diet and their baseline. If someone is eating a very high sodium diet to begin with, well, one, when we start, I'm probably going to
It's probably
try
not going to
to
happen.
intervene with that. But I do have some people that will come to me and they eat lots of the salty meat, like the lunch meats, things like that. Their sodium intake is just out the wall. And then they're wanting to use a sodium supplement. And I say no in that sense. We don't need to be adding an extra gram of sodium onto a diet that has 8 grams of sodium in it to begin with. But if we're eating a whole food based diet, you're probably not getting a lot of sodium. So that in that sense, salting your food is important. I have some people that will use some electrolyte replacements, like Element or Drip Drop. It depends on the athlete. It's not something that I'm going to say this is like standard for everyone. I tell them to do it. It depends on, the time of day they train, their climate, their sweat levels, their sodium in their diet. There's lots of different factors before I say, hey, let's use an electrolyte replacement. But I do use them.
Yeah, I think there's also something to be said about like during training, especially if you have very heavy compound lifts, bringing salt during that. And because a lot of times our first place is carbs, carbs, carbs. Carbs are really, really important, but we're sweating a lot. Those muscular contractions use a ton of sodium. And so especially if you're doing very heavy lifts, Like a lot of my clients are like, oh, I cramp really hard. I have like heavy benches or heavy deadlifts or squats. I'm like, that's because you're using a lot of salt. It's a sign that you probably need to have a little more salt, maybe like before you come in and train. And even during the session, like if I have squats and deadlifts, I'm always pounding at least 500 milligrams of sodium before I move onto deadlift. And how long does it take actually for that sodium to like actually like hit like quote unquote your bloodstream? I don't know how else to say it. Like actually start to like get used. So there's like in terms of like sodium timing, like when should you do that?
I typically have my athletes do it with their pre-workout meal. I
About an
don't know,
hour.
to be honest. I completely don't know the exact timing of when it's actually going to hit the bloodstream and start working, but I typically will recommend that like 30 to 60 minutes before.
Makes good sense. Cool. So we
Yeah.
covered that. Now going on to the last macro, fats. In terms of dietary fats, obviously we need a certain amount to promote certain cells signaling processes, overall hormonal health, and skin and whatnot. Also just help promote satiety. But in terms of timing that and then amount of like fats per day, how much do you? This is something I also see. I have to let my powerlifters like say stop eating all this fat. Like, what do you typically tell them in terms of, I guess, types of fats? Because I do know, correct me if I'm wrong, type of fats you actually do ingest play a pretty big impact on your microbiome, as well as like I think there's like a difference between like if you have a lots of saturated or trans fats versus like omega threes. It's like it can actually make a big difference like your metabolic rate even.
Yeah, absolutely. If your omega-3 to omega-6 ratio is off, it can have negative inflammatory effects on the body. So we do want to focus on those unsaturated fats, those heart healthy fats. So like the olive oil, avocado oils, avocados, nuts, seeds, nut butters, those types of fats. And I do think there is a place for animal fats from natural foods, from the eggs and from ground beef, steak that are from good sources. That's keyword, from good sources, for those animal-based fats. The fats that we want to avoid are those trans fats and the saturated fats from processed foods. So if you think like your baked goods, your fried foods, your cookies, your donuts, cakes, all of those foods, those are the types of fats that have negative impacts on heart health, on your gut microbiome. They're just, those are the foods. I don't want to say that they're bad, but we don't want to have them on a daily basis. Those are more of your treats, essentially. There's different aspects to food choices. There's choosing food for fuel, but also choosing food for fun purposes and for, emotional reasons. Those are going to be more of the fun and emotional side of things. Those aren't going to be the foods that are fueling your lifts. So with that, typically I will never have someone under 35, 40 grams of fat as a woman. Most people are eating a lot more fat than that. That's kind of like the threshold, need to be above that for hormone health. But it kind of varies then based on that. Some people do really well with higher fat, not as much carb. Some people don't do well with fat. They want lower fat, higher carb. Kind of depends on the person. And we have those conversations, what they prefer. Some people like cooking lots of their food in oil, so their fat intake might be higher. It kind of depends. So we have those conversations like, do you prefer carbs or fat? Obviously, I will make the educated choice of when it's okay to have one higher, one lower, etc. But we kind of work to find a healthy medium there. As for the timing, fat intake, we want to have not around the pre-workout timing. So those are going to be your meals that are farther away from lifts that we have the fat containing meals. So with that, pre-workout, we don't want to have fat because it's slow digesting. So if we have a high fat meal before a lift, all the blood flow is going to our gut to digest the food. It's not going to our muscles to lift the weights that we need to be lifting. So it can be a performance, or it can negatively impact performance there, and also just result in some gastric issues. So for that reason, we want that to be further away from lifting.
It makes a lot of sense. So when you say do good with higher fat, lower carb versus higher carb, lower fat, what are some things that you look for with your clients for those symptoms that might point you in that direct in one of those two directions?
Absolutely. So for some people, when your intake just gets so high, you're eating 500 plus grams of carbs, it's hard to get all of that food in. I'm talking specifically lots of my males. It's hard for them to get in all of those carbs. So that's where we might switch to some fats, because fats are higher calories per gram than carbs. So that allows them to eat less food volume. So once we hit that threshold of, okay, carbs are so high, there's not much else we can stomach. When appetite starts to decrease, then we'll start to go higher on the fat. And it's not a low carb diet. I'll never recommend a low carb diet, but we stop increasing carbs from there. We might increase fat. Other people, if they have if they have like a gluten intolerance and they hit a threshold where there's not many more carb sources that they can incorporate for their dietary restrictions, then we might choose more fats. Other people just feel better physically when they have more of one versus more of the other. So that's where it's important to learn your body and learn how you react to different foods.
Yeah, I definitely think that and, like it's just I've had experience where I've tried higher fat diets versus more higher carb, and I think a lot of it has to do with like my history of anorexia, where I
Hmm.
really stopped like eating fat. I thought that made you fat. Like right now, like I just don't respond very well to high fat diets. It just make me feel like very bloated and not good in general. And I mean, we all know what not good means, so I don't really think we need to define what that
Uh-huh.
means. But
Uh-huh.
I guess one thing I do think is an interesting part is, we mentioned bodybuilders earlier. There is a very common notion where people will do or practice where they will do training day macros and rest day macros. What do you think is the energy expenditure of the training first off is not high. It's not as high as people think, but you're still burning some calories. Um, but some people argue this is minutia that you shouldn't worry about. Some people also say this is what you should worry about if you're worried about maximizing recovery. Do you like assigning training day and rest day calories, or do you just prefer to keep it even throughout the week?
Again, it's nuanced. It totally depends on the person. If someone is putting, I often like to do higher training day macros so that way they can, have a bigger pre-workout meal, have a bigger post-workout meal. But when I say a higher carb day, it's not going to be a huge difference. It may be a couple hundred grams or a couple hundred calories worth of carbs difference there. But for most people, I do keep it consistent. If you're in a bulk and we're trying to gain muscle, I always keep it consistent. It's usually just when cutting to give that extra little oomph, essentially, of energy that I'll use that. But it totally depends on the person. And that's where I do with all my athletes, I take into account all of their, concerns. We have that question like, would you prefer to eat a little bit more on a training day to feel better rather than, have the same thing continuously each day? And some people respond well to it, others don't. So it's kind of a trial and error process. You can argue both sides of it. But I think at the end of the day, it comes down to diet adherence being the most important thing.
Right. And I also think that, if we're talking about a bulk or a cut, your rate or magnitude of surplus or deficit should be in a, pretty reasonable place where, excess fat gain isn't really an issue or muscle loss isn't really a large issue. But like you said, personal preference is what goes into it probably the most with that. So I guess we're going off of that in terms of, magnitudes of deficits and surpluses for strength athletes. I do think this is a very common distinction because again, we have to remind ourselves our number one goal as strength athletes, although body composition absolutely does matter, it's not the number one goal. And so I do
Mhm.
think that there probably should be a slightly different approach to how you do gain weight and how you do cut weight as a powerlifter, being that strength is your number one goal. So what do you typically like to advise? Obviously, it depends, and it depends on like lots of things, which are like training advancement and whatnot. But what do you typically like to, or some I guess guidelines you like to fall under?
Absolutely. So I think majority of power lifters, if we are just training right now, we don't necessarily have a specific goal. Like being in an 100 to 200 calorie surplus to train can be really ideal for a lot of power lifters. It helps with recovery, it helps with performance, gives you that just little bit of extra cushion during training. So I think if we're staying there, we're in a good spot. If weight goes up, that's just, it's a small calorie deficit. It's enough that you can gain muscle on it where you're not going to put on too much fat. You know, if weight is plateauing and strength is plateauing, then we know it's probably nutrition that is an issue and we need more food. And the same kind of thing goes with cutting. I usually do a more conservative deficit with power lifters, knowing that too, if we have a weight goal that we need to meet, we can always water and gut cut weight off. So I typically do a smaller deficit and then I adjust if we are just plateauing. So if we're not seeing weight loss, you know, realistically, if you're training for a while, that weight loss might just be a half pound a week on average. At first, it's probably going to be more than that because you're depleting glycogen, you're depleting water. So you might lose a little bit more at first. But if we're still losing like a half pound, a pound a week, that's realistic. So as long as the numbers are going where we want them to go, I'm not going to change calories essentially. But both sides of the spectrum, I take a very conservative approach to bulking and to cutting because, you know, we don't want to totally just plummet strength, but we also, on the other side of things, we don't want to just put on a ton of fat.
Right? Because the reality is that if you think about the role of a surplus, it's just to help you recover a little bit better, and we don't need a lot extra to make sure that that is happening. Although you should be intentional about eating a little bit more. Like I said, it's not. Unfortunately, it's not you eat a pint of Ben Jerry's extra per day and you just get jacked, and you get huge, but not in the way that you want.
Yeah.
I also think that we're talking about like leverages for like cutting and bulking too. If you're changing like your leverages like too fast, like that's a really big issue, and that's one of the reasons why people always ask me like, well, like, why don't you just gain weight faster? I'm like, because I'm a deadlifter. Like it
Yeah.
really does matter
Me
to me that
too.
my waist size stays around the same size, and it's I'm used to moving a certain way. If I change things too fast, it's going to be an issue of like there's some increased risk of like injury too if you're changing how you are moving. But I think from us also just like an aesthetics perspective, like because like I do think that how you look it does matter to a certain extent, especially because like I've also seen this objection with lots of powerlifters. Like if they like how they look, they like the training more. They like how they're typically going to feel better too. In most cases, especially as powerlifters, like once your body gets too lean, the strength is pretty much going to like tell you that you're not in a good spot with recovery. But I do think it's hard to create that buy-in of patience during the process. Um, but that's where hiring somebody like you to really take the reins and say, okay, well, this is like where we're heading in the right direction here. We should make this change or not is very helpful, especially during those body composition changes. Because it's hard to do that on your own.
Absolutely. I think where a lot of people fall into the trap too is that they think if they gain weight, they're going to be a better lifter. And that is not true all the time. Yes, if you slowly put on muscle and, are training hard, you're progressing each week, your lift should go up. You should go in that direction. But if you just put on 10 pounds of fat, that's not necessarily going to do you any good. Like you said, it might screw up your leverages. It might ruin your body image. There's a lot of different things that go into it. So I think really sitting down and writing out your goals of like, what do I want out of my lifts? What do I want out of my body composition? And then figuring out from there what is most important to you can be helpful in making that decision of, okay, what kind of surplus should I be in? Do I need to hire a coach to help me with this and just push you in the right direction?
Yeah, another thing is also just creating timelines for that, like realistic timelines with like muscle growth. Like, for example, like moving up a weight class should probably take you like at least a year to do properly, in my opinion, especially like how big the gaps are, especially like in like men. It's like, if you're gaining like even longer than that, honestly, like, going from like 181 to 198, that's a lot of muscle. That can even take you like
Yeah.
up to like 3 years. And so there's no real need to like really rush that process. And I think that as long as you are taking it slow enough, like you're going to recomp anyways over maintenance. And this is actually something I'm also going to say that's interesting about your approach there too. I remember in reading Stronger by Science some research reviews, and they were saying that we actually know that recomposition even happens in a calorie deficit of like 500 calories. So you're
Mhm.
also like kind of doing like the double whammy there with taking things a little bit slower, and that's why you get the big bucks for the dietitian coaching.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's where a lot of power lifters fall short on things too. They lack the patience to really just take the time to actually grow in the right way and to maximize things. That's where too people mess up on their training. I'm sure you see that all the time. You are so determined to get a number that you overshoot and then you set yourself back for a whole training block. And, you could blame it on everything else, but at the end of the day, it's not being patient and letting the numbers come to you.
I think a really helpful reframe too is all I'm doing is I'm just signaling to my body what I want it to do. Besides that, I'm kind of not in control. Like, theoretically, oh, I should be losing like, half a pound of tissue per week, but well, you're going to have body water fluctuations. Other things are going to happen. Maybe you're building some muscle. It's never exactly how you want it to be. And so just like letting go a little bit of that control, more respecting the process tends to be helpful, but I only say respect the process once your approach is actually sound.
Yeah.
But again, remind yourself that it's about signaling. You cannot force your body to do anything. Your body is smarter than you.
Absolutely. And if you're not controlling every variable, I mean, we've touched on training, we've touched on nutrition, but if you're not sleeping, if you're not getting your steps, if you're not drinking water, if you're not managing your stress, you can hit your macros and hit your training day out, but if you're not signaling those other processes and doing the right things, your body's not going to react in a positive way either. And that's too, that can play into the weight loss aspect of things. I have so many people that sleep like crap. They don't drink their water, but they can control their nutrition and they can control their training. They don't see the weight change because of those other variables that aren't controlled.
Right. And then, it does take a little bit more effort, but like we said, like if you really say you want, extreme results, your dedication should be more extreme in that way and be more willing to do little things because, I mean, I talk about this all the time. For most people, the little details do not matter. For people who are really strong or trying to get really strong or really muscular or retain their strength as they're getting leaner, the little details are literally the difference between are you going to be able to hit your third deadlift or not?
Yeah, that's so true. And I think as you get more advanced too, those little details start to become more of a big deal to you personally. Like I can speak for myself, and I'm sure you being on the level that you can, if you have a bad night's sleep before a big deadlift session, that screws you up. Whereas someone who is just starting, that might not matter as much, but those little things do matter once you get to a high level.
Yeah, it's interesting as people be like, oh, like if I underate for like a few days, like it has to also do with the fact I'm leaner than most powerlifters. Like it really does affect me, and I do notice
Yeah.
that that's because everything I have is like really regimented. I know how it's supposed to feel, and if it's off, and like I said, it bothers you. And if it doesn't bother you, that tells a lot about sort of like actually how serious that you are taking this. But one thing I will say though is that if you are frustrated with your results, like look at like your effort. Are you doing everything you possibly can with your nutrition, your lifestyle, and your training to really deserve that progress? Because you want to put yourself in the best position. And like I always tell my athletes, like during meet prep, if you have something on the platform, do you really want to like say like I didn't do everything I possibly could? That hurts, and I've been there. I've been there before. And my thing has always been eating enough because again, the anorexia background does impact that mentally. It's like I'm better. I'm up 60 pounds in 6 years, but I still have that brain there, and I have to always kind of constantly fight it.
Absolutely. I have a background of being a marathon runner who was definitely malnourished, never diagnosed anorexia, but if you got me to a practitioner, I probably was. And I can tell you from that day on, that was one promise I made to myself. I will never let myself undereat. So I will never miss calories. I will never let myself undereat. That is the most important part of my regimen personally. So I can totally relate to you on that.
Yeah, no, I think it is interesting because like we can try a lot of times people don't do that in a powerlifting space, but I think that's one of the reason why I think it's such a positive sport for most people because if you're focusing on feeling good in your performance, like you're doing all the things that we talked about in this podcast. Number one, you're probably have a pretty healthy relationship with exercise and with food. Number two, you're probably going to have a physique that's pretty awesome. You're probably going to look pretty good for doing things the right way, and just focusing more on that performance is just really positive, like how you're feeling. And really, I would argue that's probably your number one job, anyways. like, everything that we're doing here, it's help you feel better. It's help your flow be better with training, have more predictable outcomes. Because especially as powerlifters and people that do take training seriously, I can objectively say, even if it might sound vain, I don't care. My life is better when training is going better, and I like how I look.
I agree 100%. If you mentioned this being a lifestyle too, and I think that's really important to highlight. This isn't just something that you're doing for fun a few hours a week. This is a lifestyle. It's a lifestyle change, and it's the positive one. I think it can benefit a lot of people. But if you're day in, day out, putting in hours of work, you're controlling everything. When you see the results, it's exciting and you want to keep going. When you're seeing the results, you're happy, you feel good, you feel like you've accomplished something, and you just want to keep doing what you're doing.
100%. And just really thinking, long term about about your goals, and saying, am I going to be happier doing what I'm doing right now and not making those changes? Or going to be happier if I tolerate a little bit of discomfort and discipline myself? It's like, I would, it kills me when I see people not doing everything they possibly can. But I guess, is there anything else that you wanted to touch on before we end things off?
My only other thing, I think we talked about micronutrients a little bit, and I just wanted to touch on the importance of getting blood work too for anyone that's listening to this. Since we didn't go into full detail on supplements, vitamins, minerals, but something I do really stress the importance of if you're at a high level of is getting blood work to make sure that you're healthy, to make sure that you're not lacking on any nutrients. So those are the kind of things that we can supplement. Um, that's pretty much all else I had to say.
I think that's a very important thing, because lots of times people make that health, you should have a targeted approach with your micronutrient supplementation. Obviously, having a diverse diet pattern, following all the practices we sort of talked about here, is important. But having blood work is going to really help you actually understand, okay, like, what do I want my deficient in? And say if you actually are verified deficient in vitamin D, or calcium, or iron, you could be like, oh, well, I can change these dietary patterns. So I can include more food sources, probably first and foremost, and then you get your lab levels rechecked. And then if that's you need a supplement, then you can target that, and you're not going to have risk of, like, especially overdosing on, like, fat soluble vitamins. That could be a really
Absolutely.
big issue.
Absolutely. Yeah, the supplement question is one that I get so often from people, and it'll be just random people on Instagram too, like, what supplements do you recommend? And I'm like, okay, I recommend that you go get blood work and then we can talk. There are some general things, like most Americans are deficient in vitamin D and magnesium, but like you said, we don't want to over supplement anything. So go get tested, see where your levels are at. Ideally, if you can get it once or twice a year, especially if you are really serious into your fitness journey. We see all these outside measures, we see your physique, we see your performance. It's also important to know what's going on internally.
Absolutely. Well, Paige, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. This is a really awesome conversation. I learned a lot. I'm sure the listeners did as well. If people want to hire you and work one-on-one with you, get jacked, strong, accomplish all their goals, and with 100% certainty, how can they hire you?
They can go to my Instagram profile. It's Paige Myers _RD, and I have an application in my bio. And I just wanted to say again, thanks so much, Adam. It has been such a pleasure.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun. So thank you guys, listeners, for listening. I'll catch you guys on the next episode.